As Ruth said, this is work that's focusing on the productivity of the females in the breeding herd and fairly specifically targeted at that productivity in the commercial herd. We work a lot with stud breeders, we work a lot on research properties, but the ultimate aim of all of that work is to change and hopefully improve productivity at the commercial level. So that's very much the objective of this work and pretty much of everything we do at BreedPlan. So I think Steve kind of summarised well that we've had a lot of focus on tropical breeds recently, and that was all to do with a very clear issue around reproductive performance in those tropical breeds. There was a lot of funding made available to tackle that issue, to see if there was an opportunity to improve it by selection, which turned out there was. And we've kind of gone hammer and tongs at that one for some time now. We are starting now to see if we can transplant some of that wisdom into temperate breeds, and a lot of the discussion today around female reproduction will be dealing with that sort of work. So relevant to temperate breeders. And this is certainly new stuff as well. We often in these sort of presentations like to talk about stuff that is reasonably proven, certainly is out there in the literature, stuff we've done and are very confident in. This is very new work. We've only just published some of this stuff and other parts of it are completely unpublished. So very new. Our confidence in these results are not as high as they'd be if they were, if we'd been working on it for longer. But I think it's good for a group like this to see what we're doing right now, what we're thinking right now, and where we're hoping this sort of work will take us. So the areas I'd like to look at are around the genetics of cow body composition, how these females are able to maintain themselves through that annual cycle of reproduction, of calving, lactation, and being able to get back in calf. Secondly, we'll look at some new ways of describing female reproduction, in part to combat this challenge we've got with increasing levels of AOI, meaning more and more females are being synchronised, which means our conventional measure of days to calving that we use to describe female reproduction isn't available in those animals. So we're needing a replacement, and I don't think anyone will deny that getting that aspect of productivity well described in the evaluation is really important. If there's time, we'll talk a bit about southern multi-breeds. Steve did cover that fairly thoroughly, but there's just a few aspects of it that relate specifically to people in this room that I'll go into a bit more depth on. And I think any aspects of these things that people want to talk about, if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask them. If we only get through the first bit by the end of this hour, I will consider that a roaring success. So, looking at the cow body composition side of this work, this is looking, as I said, at the ability of wet females to maintain themselves through that annual cycle. It's a really important trait to the breeding objective. It has a really key role in describing feed and feed costs in our description of the production systems that go into our calculation of selection indexes. And it may seem a little bit unintuitive, but it's how people describe the way cow condition changes through the year that we derive information about the feed requirements those females have. So we don't get a lot of information on what feed's available, how good it is, but by describing the condition cows are in through the annual cycle, we are able to infer a lot of information about the level of feeding she needs and where she's sitting as far as her energy balance goes. There's no denying, and certainly in the north we've seen it, that ability is also related to survival. So this is a trait that impacts costs associated with feed and very directly costs associated with mortality in the most extreme cases. It's also really important to say that in examining how these females are maintaining themselves, we're wanting to describe that aspect of productivity. It's not a proxy for reproduction, we know that at the phenotypic, at the management level, there is a lot of attention paid to cows needing to be in the right condition to perform reproductively. And that is absolutely true. Genetically, those relationships are not as strong. And if we've kind of learned anything over the years in working with the genetics of reproduction, it's that the best way to describe it is to measure it. And I think that's the case for all of our evaluations in all breeds. If you want to have access to good information about genetic reproduction, you have to measure that trait. And we'll look at ways to do that in a sec. There is no doubt that we've been beating our heads against this cow condition trait for a long time. This is a paper that was published in 1996 by some people who are still very present in our industry. Dave Johnson is my colleague at AGBU. Hamish may be familiar to some of you as a MLA genetics manager. This was tackled a while ago. After that work, what they found is that within groups of females, evaluated in industry, our ability to pick differences wasn't spectacular. And as a result, heritability for that trait wasn't especially high. We've probably mentioned the word heritability a few times throughout the day, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. Heritability is just a description of the degree to which the variation we see in a trait out in the paddock is due to genetics. So it's a number between 0 and 1. As that number approaches 1, we understand that there's more genetic control. As it goes down, there's less genetic control. Most of the traits we deal with in animal genetics are in that range of 0.2 to 0.4, 0.5% heritable, or 20 to 50% heritable. And that heritability has a direct impact on how accurately EBVs are estimated and impacts our ability to make genetic progress for these traits. I do go on a bit, but it's worth pointing out that traits that have lower heritability do not mean that you cannot achieve genetic progress. It's all about the amount of variation that's present in those traits. So, condition lowly to moderately heritable, lower opportunity to apply selection and change that sort of trait. The recommendations at the end of that was that we need more records, better data, and there was some suggestion that some subjective measures could be useful in that mix. We can also observe that Angus have recently released cow body condition EBVs. These are based on breeder-submitted data, condition described as condition score, and recorded at the weaning of wet females' calves. They published those results a few years ago, and the numbers stack up quite similarly with what we'd seen, back in 1996. Kind of 0.1, 0.2 sort of heritability. Their conclusions were that we needed more records, and made the very accurate observation that if we're going to wield a trait like this in the evaluation, we need to understand how selection in that direction will impact other traits. So, wanting to understand genetic relationships with other traits in the evaluation. And certainly what we're doing at Rennie-Lee, at Waroona, and with some other herds is very much building on that work. So the whole idea is to take some of that early advice and include some more objective description of how a cow is maintaining her condition into this trait. After a lot of discussion, we've ended up zeroing in fairly specifically on cow condition in wet first calvers. The experience says that that's when a lot of cows in the country are at their lowest condition throughout their life. And even if that's a little bit later, it's still the point when her condition is most likely to impact productivity. It's when that condition really bites as far as rebreeding goes. So this is data we don't have at the moment, and I've had to come out of retirement as a scanner basically, whip around a bunch of herds and collect some of this data in wet first calvers. We're doing that in seed stock herds as well as research herds. We're collecting scanned information, so that's P8 and rib fatness, scanned eye muscle area, at the same time getting weights, hip heights and a condition score. And the whole objective of this process is to describe cow condition very specifically in these cows as they go into that second mating in terms of weight, height, fatness and eye muscle area. All of those will hopefully, if the plan works, contribute to an EBV for cow condition. And the nice thing about that is that it will still be expressed in terms of condition. You'll be able to make a selection decision on the basis of an EBV that looks like a condition score. It'll include information from all of these traits as well as other traits in the evaluation. And the hope is that it will be more heritable. It'll be a better basis for selection. In formulating this analysis, we get some information about how all of these things, weight, height, fat depth and eye muscle, actually relate to cow condition. And these changes are kind of with the assumption of all else being equal, but an increase in weight, increase in fatness, increase in eye muscle are associated with cows in better condition, and I don't think anyone will be shocked by that. And at the same time, an increase in height is associated with cows in lower condition. And I think that's an interesting result. Pleasingly, when we crunch all of these numbers, we end up with a trait that's not, 10, 20% heritable, but we're up around 40 or 50% heritable. And that means we've got a lot more power to make selection decisions for this sort of thing. And it means that EBVs will be spread out a lot more, so you'll be able to identify differences more accurately. And that means we can change it more easily if we want to do that. And really importantly, and I'll say this a couple times through the course of this, it gives us the opportunity to monitor this really important trait as we push in other directions. If we want to go our hardest for marbling, for early growth, we can do that. But we could, with this EBV sitting there in the background, do that in the knowledge of how cow condition is going to behave as we make those decisions. And by doing this within the breed plan framework, it allows us to pull in information about all of the other traits in the evaluation, so we'll understand how making changes to cow condition will impact marbling, will impact growth, will impact fertility, which is very useful. And it will be able to go directly into our index, our breeding objective work, as a trait that is very much a part of formulating the costs and responses to inputs in that system. So as far as this condition work goes, I think we're at the stage now where we want to encourage some seed stock breeders to be collecting this data. It is an imposition. Intermating is not a time that we generally mess with the females a great deal. With so much AI going on, it's easier to do it, but it's still getting in the road a bit. And I'm acutely aware when I'm collecting this data that I'm not universally loved for being in amongst the AI programs. It's an additional measurement and it takes time at a very complicated time. So we'll work with some seed stock herds. We will certainly record it as intensively as we can in our research herds. And that will be southern multi-breed, and certainly in the north we're doing it in repronomics as well. Done. Any thoughts or questions on that female condition side of things? Yep.
What's your opinion on the
I think what we saw, within those cow body composition traits, I think that's what we'll see genetically. I think we will see, and it's not shocking, favourable relationships of condition with weight and fat and an eye muscle area and height. Whether we actually bring height into the evaluation or not, or let it just sit there as a descriptor of condition, I don't know. And we are at that stage of the research where we are not sure what we're going to see. And it's, as I said, this is early days. I tried to do that analysis before I came here. I knew somebody would ask that question. We didn't. Good on me. We didn't have enough data. We kind of fed it into the computer and it collapsed. We don't have enough numbers yet, but we will have. Wayne?
I've done a recent analysis on that from the BCRC data, and I think you took a broad approach. I think it's something like 30 or 40% of the genetic variation in cow composition is independent of yearling composition. So I asked the question, if I adjusted for yearling growth and fat and muscle and intramuscular fat, all of those things, how much variation we see in cow composition traits, and it's like at least a third of the variation in cow composition is independent of those yearling traits.
Absolutely, and that's a really good point. We will be able to leverage our early scanning results, our standard breed plan scanning, but it is certainly not all of the story. Once females go into that lactation phase, how they performed as heifers, it only bears some relationship to how they perform as mature females. Yep. Yep.
Is she consuming more feed to be there, or is she just better at converting the feed to be there?
It could be either. And by bringing this stuff into the breed plan evaluation, we'll have the best opportunity to pin down how this is related to feed efficiency, both of steers and our kind of derived and kind of rough understanding of female efficiency as well. But we will get that information. We don't have it yet. But I think Wayne's observation that a lot of what drives females' condition is associated with appetite could certainly be the case. Yep. No, so this is specifically in those wet cows at their second mating. And that was on the back of a lot of work we've done, particularly in the north, that says it's those first rebreed females who are at the lowest condition of any time in their life. I know that as we come south, it may be that time moves a little bit towards weaning and can be at weaning in some production environments. But I think the idea that it's at mating where conditions really going to impact productivity stands up fairly well. If they're in poor condition at that stage, that's when it's going to bite as far as reproduction goes and remaining in the herd goes. Yep.
Matt, do you have a comment on the role of intramuscular fat as a potential body reserve and what impact that might have on the body condition score of the mature animal?
It's a really good question, and there is a lot of physiology going on in how energy, and it's what we're really talking about. When we're talking about condition, it's how cows are partitioning the energy that's available to them. And whether that's put into marbling or subcutaneous fat or muscle or height will all impact that overall picture of condition differently. And certainly marbling, we are not capturing at all well in a standard condition score. It's probably the least well described when we're just looking at an animal. I made the decision in the early stages of this project not to measure marbling in these females because I thought a proportion of them at least would be in sufficiently poor condition that we couldn't. Turns out that is partly true. I am not entirely happy with that decision, though. I think we will start measuring marbling, and I think it will be really interesting to see where it fits into that. Is it higher, is it lower? Is it higher marbling associated with better condition? Is it possibly associated with lower condition? We don't know. But we will be able to get the genetic correlation with carcass marbling, with scan marbling in young females, and that'll take us a fair way down that track of understanding how those relationships stack up. Excellent. Wayne?
Have you analysed to see what the genetic correlation between the cow condition traits and their milk EBV is?
Yes, and we can say that with a fair bit of confidence that higher milk is certainly associated with lower condition. And that is a pretty reasonable and understandable correlation. If they're putting, again, that energy they have into that milk reserve or milk production, it has to come from somewhere, and certainly the fat on her back and her maintaining her own condition is one of the sources of that energy. We've got really good information on that from the north. We will build that up in the south as we go along here. Yep. Very much. So this is the third side of that triangle. I think we've got reproductive performance, mature size, and condition. And they're kind of the three. Well, and milk is the fourth side of that triangle. And how those all stack up are all part of the story. And we will understand that as time goes by, as we collect this data. Well, there's been a push for a long time for mature cow weights and mature cow weight EBVs to be adjusted for cow condition. I think it's much more informative to have those two numbers sitting beside each other. I think the idea of adjusting to a constant condition for mature cow weight, it can be a bit hard to get your head around. I think it's far better just to have a weight EBV and a condition EBV sitting beside each other. And that's certainly what we hope will be the outcome of this work. Very good. Number two, so moving on now from condition to look at work we're doing with female reproduction traits. And this is taking the wisdom we gathered in working in the north, some of the CRC work that Steve described, and transplanting it into the south and seeing if we can get any value out of those traits in temperate breeds. I think Steve's already said that we have this dilemma of increasing of levels of AI, meaning that days to calving numbers are reducing, and pretty drastically. Despite this, cow weaning rate is still one of the, if not the most important driver of productivity for cattle breeders, for cattle producers. So this is a really important trait. We're describing it less and less well in our evaluation, and I think we really need a way to improve that description. The way we're doing it is through observing directly ovarian function. So these things look pretty familiar at this stage. We are serially ultrasound scanning heifers, and this is specifically looking at age at puberty. So observing ovarian function to tell us when females become pubertal. The only way to do that is by starting early, before animals are displaying signs of estrus, scanning them and keeping doing that until we pick up a corpus luteum. And this is the ovary. This structure here is what we're looking at in both of these fairly different looking pictures. This is a prepubal, or at least a non-cycling ovary. Lots of little black follicles spread around that area. This is a pubertal or cycling ovary, one big donut-shaped corpus luteum, and that's the structure we're looking for to identify whether a female's pubertal or not. And Johnny? Sorry, use a... Absolutely. So that, this is newish technology. The heat time collars are even newer. So these heat time collars are a really exciting development in this area. It's just a collar and you put around their neck, and it identifies behaviour which is indicative of cyclicity. And we've done some research in the south, in Angus, quite a bit in the north in tropical breeds. And I think we're getting really good evidence that this is working well for puberty. So this is a possibility. They're really pretty expensive, not that scanning isn't. It takes some convincing to marshal the resources we need to put collars on all these heifers and on those first calvers as well, because that return to service is at least as important as this trait. So collars are coming and they'll be a really useful contribution in this area. So as far as this research went, and I will give results here for Angus. We did Angus and Herefords. This is another project that we did both at Waroona and at Rennie and on other cooperating Angus and Hereford stud herds. I will just talk about the results for Angus because it halves the number of numbers I've got to put on the screen, and what we saw in the two breeds was almost identical. But in Angus, we did about 3,100 heifers, started scanning at weaning, carried through to synchronisation for AI. All of these females were AI'd. My expectation in putting this little project together was that by the time we get to that synchronisation point, there'll be 70, 80, 85% cycling. We'll pick up the vast majority of variation in age of puberty, and we will not have to worry too much about that really hard intervention of synchronisation and its impact on the variation we're able to observe. As I said, exactly the same protocol followed for about 1,000 Hereford heifers. So scanning started when we got the first report of estrus behaviour from each herd. We go in, start scanning, and then we scanned every month or so after that up until synchronisation, which is a lot of work. If you think we're in the road scanning their wet first calvers, we were seriously in the road scanning these heifers every month between weaning and their first mating. It was as big an imposition as we've put on commercial stud operators, and it was a great pleasure that people saw the value in this and were willing to put up with that. And that meant we got about 4 scans per female between that weaning and mating period, which is really distinct to the data we get in the north, where you're mating Brahman heifers as 2-year-olds. We still start scanning at weaning, and if you do that every month until they go into mating as 2-year-olds, you end up with 10, 12, 15, 20 records through that period. So it's much more thorough data. We had to make sure we got scanned at every opportunity we could to get something that even resembled that. So on the back of this information, we kind of defined 3 traits. There was a straight, what if you just scanned on the day or as those animals went into mating? A 1-0, were you displaying signs of estrus or not? For those animals that were pubertal, we calculated an age of puberty, which is just the date that we identified their first CL minus their date of birth. That is a trait only of females which did cycle. We also created a penalised trait, which is just adding a fixed amount to those animals that didn't cycle, making them just worse than everyone else, basically. But that meant that every animal had a record, and we were able to analyse every animal in the analysis of that last trait. So we finished up scanning for this particular project at the end of 2018. I think it's well worth saying that 2017 and 2018 were pretty tough years in a lot of the areas we were scanning. And I think the results we saw in those years certainly reflect that. We're repeating this sort of work in the Southern Multi-Breed, and we're seeing quite different results. These results have been published for both Hereford and Angus, some of them quite recently. But I think it's a bit frustrating for someone who works with numbers all the time that one of the most interesting results to come out of this is a simple average. But that average tells us that it was only about half of the females that we went in and scanned from weaning up until synchronisation that showed any signs of cycling. And to me, that was really unexpected. I did not think the proportion of pubertal females would be that low by the time they went into mating. 53% for Angus, almost identical results in Herefords. My first thought was that we're doing something wrong, that really is unlikely to be true, but we confirmed that by multiple and really experienced operators across multiple breeds, and in the end we had to say, I think it's right. On average, for those animals that did cycle, their age at puberty was very close to a year old. When we apply a penalty, that age gets very, very close to their mating age, which being 50-50 fits perfectly. So, heritability is an important number, and I think it's worth just explaining the heritability result for these traits relative to other traits in the evaluation. This is heritability from 0 to 1 for a few traits in our evaluation. This is weaning weight, 600-day weight, carcass weight, covering the range from about 0.15 up to about 0.4, 15 to 40% heritable. Excuse me. For our carcass traits, eye muscle area, marbling, P8 fatness, occupying the same sort of range, from about 25 to 40% heritable. For days to calving, our heritability we know is low, and that was around under 10%, around 8% for these animals. Our puberty trait was about double that, so simply going in on the day of mating produced a trait that was twice as heritable. We have to say that the fact that they were 0.5 gives a 1-0 trait the absolute maximum chance to be useful that it can be. If they had been 90 and 10, that would be significantly lower. And our penalised age at puberty trait is as heritable as any trait in the evaluation. And I think the difference between that number and that number means that we have created a lot of opportunity if we want to measure these traits and include them in the evaluation to apply selection or, as I said before, to keep an eye on these vitally important traits as we push in other directions. So as we really go hard for marbling, as we go hard for growth, it's really important that we're able to understand the consequences of that for reproduction. I think these sort of traits will give us a really good opportunity to do that. So the next step with all of this is we desperately need data in naturally mated females. And we're going to have to step outside of industry to get that with the really high level of AI. We're going into the Southern Multi-Breed herd. We're scanning all of those heifers from weaning through to mating and then beyond mating to see if you're not cycling at mating, how long does it take you after the bull goes in to start firing? And really importantly, puberty is important, but the trait we really want to get at, or at least get at as well, is lactation and estrus. How long does it take you to start cycling again after calving? Puberty bites kind of once around that first mating. This idea of not cycling while you're lactating or taking time to recommence cycling as a wet female bites every year. And I think that's the more important trait. Obviously, it's one we cannot get at all in synchronised females. If you synchronise to mate, they all cycle. That variation is completely gone. So this is a trait we can only analyse in naturally mated females, and we'll be doing that as part of Southern Multi-Breed as well. So, how am I going for time, Lucinda? Good on me. All right. So just to finish off, that segues nicely into Southern Multi-Breed. Any questions on that reproduction side of things before we move on? Yep. 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 Absolutely. That is certainly a question we will be asking. So it's the observations made that under natural mating conditions, females that aren't cycling up to that mating stage clearly do cycle because we're not getting 50% reproduction rates in our temperate breeds. So the question is around a bull effect and the impact of condition on how that's affecting her cyclicity. Certainly the condition question is one we're going to have to answer as more data becomes available. Yeah, we certainly know that being in adequate condition is absolutely required phenotypically, in the paddock on the day to be reproductively successful. The question of a bull effect, we've got a lot of information and a lot of publication of ram effects in sheep, a lot less in cattle. But I think that tells us, and we know that in those heifers that we said, God, they're only 50% cycling, this can't be right. Once they were synchronised, the reproductive rates out of those were just fine. They were up in that 80 plus 90%. So synchronisation certainly works. We need to understand that in naturally mated females, and that is the next step. But certainly a big trigger, like putting a bull in, is going to have an impact. So they may meander along up until mating at 50, under better conditions, 60, 70%, put a bull in and everything just fires. So we will see what happens on that front.
So Jack, just on that.
Yep.
In the Black Baldy project in the first year, exactly the same number were pivotal.
Yep.
Of those that weren't pivotal, 85% of them got in calf, so natural mating.
Yes.
And on average, they in calf 7 days later than the ones that were pivotal to start with.
Exactly. So that's the sort of information that we will, we can use that, we can add to it from Southern Multi-Breed, and we can include it in the evaluation. Yep.
Does that fact that lots of them get in calf make it useless to look at variation between the puberty? You said the average was 53%, but
Yep.
ones in the woodland data, there's one right up here and one right down there.
Correct.
Is there no value in trying to identify those animals?
Not at all. I really don't think that's the case, and it has to do with our description. I think the notion that temperate breeds are not travelling too badly reproduction-wise is pretty true. People aren't knocking our door down, as they were with Brahmins, saying we have to do something about reproduction. So I think we can safely say things aren't going too badly. But I think it's equally really important to have a good description of these traits, as I said, as we push in other directions, because people certainly aren't focusing on reproduction in their breeding objective at the moment a great deal. There's not a lot of pressure put on it. As much as we say it's there, our description of it in the evaluation is not great and getting worse. So I think it's really important to have as accurate as possible a description of female reproduction in the evaluation to keep an eye on as we go in other economically important directions. The last thing you want is to find yourself in trouble with reproduction because it is a long road back. Yep.
Mate, obviously there's suspicion around the potential for bull effect on natural mated animals.
Yep.
Have you got a comment on difference you observed in first cycle or AI conception rates between the pubertal and the non-pubertal heifers in that group?
I've parked that. That is something we're going to come back to. I don't have the data we need to tick off all of the questions we want to ask in that area, and I've kind of resisted doing it part way. So we'll wait till we get some good data in from Southern Multi-Breed to tackle all of those questions. Not as strong as you might think. And again, it comes back to this phenotypic versus genetic. But genetically, those relationships, and I literally this morning pulled that slide out and I regret it now, kind of between 0 and 40%, depending on whether you're describing condition in terms of fatness or eye muscle area or weight or condition score, but certainly nothing like 80% or 90%. Masses of opportunity to be pubertal in different levels of heifer condition.
What about frame score? Does that have any correlation anywhere?
Similar, it's not high, but where the fat type traits tend to be favourable, height type traits tend to be less favourable. Yep.
Same question, but the scrotal, that's what we've always talked about as being a correlation with puberty.
Yep, so scrotal, when taken at exactly the right time, which is in males as they're going through puberty, is about 20% correlated with days to calving. So, better scrotal associated with lower, better days to calving. I haven't actually done the correlations of scrotal with puberty yet, but we certainly will. I'm really hoping we can get some percent normal in herds associated with the Southern Multi-Breed females that we're evaluating for all of these female traits, and that we can use that number as an additional descriptor of male reproduction. So again, once we can get all of that data together, I'm really keen to have a look at those numbers.
Nathan, will there be enough data in Southern Multi-Breed to get algorithms on the key traits?
There will be. It's going to take some time. It's currently a 5-year project. I think everyone expects that it will be a project that goes a bit longer than that. And the decision to include so many different breeds means that within breed, numbers aren't massive. But over time, those numbers will become available, and it'll take some time, but we will get there.
Need to talk to New South Wales Treatment.
More money would be good. Good and good. Speaking of which, we might as well just have a really quick look at Southern Multi-Breed. I think a lot of this has been said already. Wagyu, Charolais, Hereford, Shorthorns, Angus and Brahmans, and selected crossbreds. And I just thought for this crowd, and not knowing exactly what Wayne and Steve were going to talk about, I would pull out this particular aspect of it. We're certainly not getting dial crosses on every combination of every one of these breeds, but there's been a lot of interest in getting that information for the Brahman versus Angus and the Brahman crossed with Herefords. I think Steve said far better than I do on that slide that we're recording everything in this project. Every aspect of female reproduction that we can think of. We're getting all this cow body composition information. The steer half sibs of these females will go into the feedlot, be finished, and then we'll evaluate them as carcasses. We'll be looking at feed efficiency and methane production, and traits like temperament and welfare will be part of the mix as well. On the female reproduction side, will be ovarian scanning, all females up to mating and beyond. We will just keep scanning them until we get a CL from every one of those animals under natural mating conditions. We've still got relationships between what we did in Trans-Tasman and what we're doing in Southern Multi-Breed. It'll allow us to confirm those results from Trans-Tasman. And once we can do that, both that data and anything we get, well, everything we do get from Southern Multi-Breed can go straight into the breed plan evaluation for Angus and for Herefords. Exactly how we handle that is something we're still talking about, whether we produce breeding values for puberty, whether we do like we're doing in the north, allow it to sit in the background and just drive accuracy and range for days to calving. We're still working out. And it's, it's something we're happy to talk to people about. So, this looks very much like a slide Wayne had up. We have got Brahman bulls, Angus bulls, Hereford bulls, and Brahman, Angus and Hereford females. We are certainly getting every one of those purebred matings. For Angus, we're getting the Angus bulls over Brahman females, Angus cows over and Brahman bulls. Same things for Herefords. What we don't have, and I'm kind of interested what people here think about this, at the moment is the Black Baldy side of things. The Black Baldy project gave us a portion of that, and that is certainly good information and we can use that. We aren't going to get the other half of that story at the moment. But certainly in developing this project, the opportunities that were there to describe Hereford and Angus genetics in terms of Brahman breeding values was where the biggest bang for our buck was felt to be, and that's certainly been the priority up till now. I think if people feel very strongly that we want the equivalent information about crossbred Black Baldy EBVs, that's work that can be prioritised as well. So, Southern Multi-Breed, intensively recording, what I think are really important economic traits, which aren't being as well recorded in industry at the moment as they could be. We're getting head-to-head management and recording of all of these 6 purebred populations, which is the information we need to produce what Steve kind of referred to as these tables. Comparison tables allow us to bring Hereford and Angus and Brahman and Charolais and Shorthorn and Wagyu EBVs into line to be able to evaluate a Hereford in terms of Angus and a Charolais in terms of Angus. But we're also getting the full dial-L cross in some cases, which will allow us to generate EBVs for crossbred animals. And these are two different things. Being able to compare purebred EBVs is not the same as producing EBVs for crossbreds, but we're certainly doing both in aspects of that population. So, how are we going? Going good. Hopefully, people get the feeling there's lots of work going on, for temperate breeders, focusing on really key traits that are associated with productivity and profitability for your breeds. The real focus being on female reproduction, how females are maintaining themselves, and any opportunity, facilitating that ability for temperate breeders to make selection decisions across breeds. That's all from me. Thank you all very much.
That's great, Matt. I'm going to start off with a bit of a left field question, and that's about what we've learnt from the dairy industry, because we know the global dairy industry's had big problems with fertility related to body composition. And, Brian and I were lucky enough to go to Chiswick and Cork in Ireland a couple of years ago and see one of the most interesting, I suppose, demonstrations of cows in the top 10% of the performance index for the Irish dairy herd and in the bottom 10%, and they had vastly different reproductive outcomes. And, there's been a fair bit of work done. So I'm just interested, do we get insights from dairy globally that help us with this work?
Well, we certainly do, and really the main insight we get is that we don't want to let ourselves get into that situation. And that's an outcome of the thing we always warn against, single trait selection, going as hard as they can for milk production without paying attention to the consequences of that for other traits. And, reproduction suffered. We can make the same observation in the north. Brahmins were not always kind of lumbered with this fertility challenge that the modern population has now. And we can actually trace that back, sorry Steve, to some fairly specific American populations that imported this association of higher growth with hardwired lactation and estrus. And that wasn't part of the population before, now it is. And we're having to fight that, and it's a really long-term challenge. So I think the main thing we've learned is we don't want to let ourselves get into that situation. I think in beef, because our definitions of profitability and productivity are broader, the risks of that happening are a bit lower, but it certainly doesn't mean we want to take our eye off the ball on any of these key traits and allow them to slide.
Why don't we have an EBV for a ratio of calf weight lean to mature cow weight?
Yep. Ratios are really useful from a management point of view. They give you a lot of information and direction in the decisions you're making in managing your herd. As a basis for selection, they lose a lot of that power. And you can imagine we're talking about two weights from two animals at two different times in their life. Really, the best way to apply selection for that is via individual understanding of those two weights. So we've got weaning weight, we've got cow mature weight. They're much more powerful bases for selection than those two kind of mashed together. Correct. Yep. Steve?
Maybe just, because next I'm going to talk about indexes, but in the index, there's actually a negative economic weighting on mature weight and a positive economic weighting for that reason. So in the way when you select on an economic index, you do get at that composite.
Good.
traits, yeah.
Good catch. I should have said that.
I was going to say something on the dairy tray.
Yep.
And maybe if you want to comment, Matt, a little bit on, you measured eye muscle area
Yep.
and how important.
I was thinking that might squeal at me. You're measuring eye muscle area in your project, and I'm thinking about Lucinda's comment about the dairy industry and what we can learn. But in old-time dairy breeders, they have a term in Canada anyways, they call it dairy character. They select for dairy character, which basically means you're selecting for a very narrow animal.
Yep.
Very sharp in the shoulders and these types of things, which doesn't lend itself a lot to muscle.
Yep.
And so you've got these animals, these high-performing dairy animals that obviously it's amazing in terms of milk production.
Yep.
But they get into this negative energy balance. And what about the fact that they've actually deliberately selected against any muscle on those animals?
Yep.
And what is that? And anyways, you're measuring eye muscle area, and what do you know about energy reserve in terms of muscle?
Muscle is really interesting. And again, a fair chunk of this understanding is coming from work in the north, but I do not doubt that it's very similar in temperate breeds. And we didn't just scan cows, at mating. We scanned them 4 or 5 times throughout the year at key times through that annual production cycle. So we had a really good picture of how all of those depots were changing, how they were gaining and losing fat, how they were burning eye muscle and putting it back on, and how they were putting on weight and height. And the thing that surprised a lot of us was the degree to which they were utilising their muscle reserves as an energy resource. Cows would get up to 70, 80 square centimetre eye muscles at peak time through the year, and they would get down to 35, 40 square centimetre eye muscles at the lowest time of year. And that was kind of on average. We had animals there that we got eye muscles on that were smaller than eye muscles we measured in sheep, 12, 15 square centimetres. They'd burned just about all of their muscle. So really interesting data. It's dynamic. It's not a situation where they burn all their fat and then start eating into the muscle. They both go down pretty much from day one, but they certainly run out of fat before they run out of muscle. And once they get into that physiological condition of having no fat, just burning muscle, things have changed. That said, some animals are able to do that a lot more happily than others. Some of our best calf producers were animals that actually used a lot of their reserves every year and put them back on. Some of them were not. Some of them were quite stable throughout the year. So there's an awful lot of really interesting stuff in there that we've got hints about, but still don't fully understand. So it's a really exciting area of research that's ongoing.